Helen Martinez pulled another thread through the delicate blue fabric, her fingers moving with practiced precision. At 40, she had found peace in the simple rhythm of her sewing machine. The small shop on Maple Street was far from glamorous, but it was hers. Sunlight streamed through the front window, illuminating the colorful fabrics that lined the walls. "Easy, Max," she whispered to the old German shepherd lying beside her chair. The dog's graying muzzle rested on his paws, but his intelligent brown eyes never left Helen. Most people in Millbrook thought Max was just her pet. They didn't know about his special training or about the years they had spent together saving lives. Helen preferred it that way. The past was something she had buried deep, along with the memories that still woke her in cold sweats some nights. Mrs. Patterson entered the shop with a small bell's cheerful ring. "Good morning, dear. Is my dress ready?" "Almost finished," Helen smiled, setting down her needle. "Just a few more alterations." Max lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching at the woman's approach. Even in retirement, his instincts remained sharp. Helen noticed and placed a gentle hand on his back. "Such a well-behaved dog," Mrs. Patterson commented. "You're lucky to have him." "Yes," Helen agreed quietly. "I am." As Mrs. Patterson left with her dress, Helen returned to her work. Outside, Millbrook continued its peaceful daily routine. Children walked to school, shop owners swept their sidewalks, and the morning sun painted everything in warm, golden light. Helen had chosen this town specifically for its quietness. After 8 years in search and rescue, she needed somewhere the ground didn't shake, where buildings stood solid and safe. Somewhere she could forget the sound of concrete cracking and people calling for help from beneath tons of rubble. 3 years had passed since Helen opened her shop. She had settled into a comfortable routine of measuring, cutting, and stitching. The trauma counselor she had seen in the city would have been proud of her progress. She rarely thought about earthquakes anymore, or the disaster in San Francisco that had ended her career. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Helen was hemming a wedding dress when Max suddenly stood up, his body tense. His nose twitched, and a low whine escaped his throat. "What is it, boy?" Helen looked up from her work. Max moved to the window, his tail straight and alert. Helen had learned to trust his instincts years ago. Something was wrong. The rumbling started low, almost like thunder in the distance. But Helen knew better. She had heard that sound too many times before. Her hands began to shake as the floor beneath her feet started to vibrate. "No," she whispered. "Not here. Not again." The earthquake lasted only 30 seconds, but it was strong enough. Helen grabbed Max's collar and rushed outside, her heart pounding. People poured out of buildings, their faces confused and frightened. Down the street, a terrible sight met her eyes. The old Morrison Building, a 3-story structure that housed the town's small library and several offices, had partially collapsed. The front wall had given way, and dust clouds billowed from the wreckage. "Help!" someone screamed from inside. "We're trapped!" Helen's body froze. She could hear the voices, faint but desperate, coming from beneath the concrete and twisted metal. Max whined and pulled toward the building, his training telling him to act. "I can't," Helen breathed. "I can't do this again." Can't. The memories flooded back like a breaking dam. San Francisco, 8 years ago. The magnitude 6.8 earthquake that had brought down the apartment building where she and her team were conducting a routine training exercise. The screaming. The dust. The moment when the aftershock had sent more debris crashing down, trapping her partner Jake beneath a concrete beam. She could still hear his voice calling her name, growing weaker with each passing minute. By the time they had freed him, it was too late. Jake had died in her arms, and Helen had never forgiven herself for not moving faster, for not being strong enough to lift that beam alone. "Helen!" Mayor Williams was suddenly beside her. Thank God you're here. Your search and rescue experience. We need you. Helen's secret was out. She stared at the mayor in shock. How did you— I did some research when you moved here, he admitted quickly. I wanted to know more about our new residents. Helen, people are trapped in there. You're the only one with the training to help them. Sirens wailed in the distance, but Helen knew it would take time for proper rescue teams to arrive from the city, time that the people inside didn't have. Max barked once, sharp and insistent. He looked at Helen with those intelligent eyes, then back at the building. His message was clear. People need help. I can't, Helen said, her voice breaking. I'm not that person anymore. I'm just a seamstress now. But even as she spoke, she could hear more voices from the rubble. A woman crying for help. A man shouting that his leg was trapped. Somewhere in the debris, people were suffering, waiting for someone to save them. Helen closed her eyes and tried to push down the panic that was rising in her chest. This was exactly what she had run from. This was her nightmare made real. Max nudged Helen's hand with his nose, then walked several steps toward the collapsed building before looking back at her. His meaning was unmistakable. We have work to do. Helen's hands were still shaking, but something in her dog's steady gaze gave her strength. They had been partners for 8 years. Max had never let her down, and she had never let him down, except for that one terrible day. Okay, she whispered. Okay, we'll try. She approached the building carefully, her trained eye assessing the damage. The front wall had collapsed inward, but the main structure appeared stable. There would be pockets of space inside where people could survive. How many people were inside? She asked Mayor Williams. We're not sure. The library was open, and Dr. Chen's office was on the second floor. Maybe Mrs. Rodriguez from the insurance company. At least 6 people, possibly more. Helen nodded, slipping back into the mental state she had once known so well. She blocked out the fear and focused on the technical aspects of the rescue. Where would the strongest spaces be? How could they reach the survivors without causing more collapse? Max, search, she commanded quietly. The old dog's entire demeanor changed. He was no longer a sleepy pet, but a trained professional. He moved systematically along the edge of the rubble, his nose working, searching for the scent of trapped people. After several minutes, Max stopped near what had once been the front entrance and barked twice. The signal for live person detected. Someone's there, Helen told the mayor. We need to clear a path, but carefully. One wrong move and we could cause more debris to fall. Her hands had stopped shaking. The familiar routine of search and rescue was taking over, muscle memory from years of training and experience guiding her actions. Helen found a flashlight in someone's emergency kit and began examining the space where Max had indicated. She could see a small gap between fallen concrete slabs, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it led into the building. Hello, she called into the opening. Can anyone hear me? Yes. Oh, thank God, came a woman's voice, weak but clear. I'm Sarah Chen. I was in my office when it happened. My leg is trapped, but I think I'm okay otherwise. Dr. Chen, this is Helen. I'm going to get you out, but I need you to stay calm. Are you injured besides your leg? I don't think so. But there's someone else here. Mrs. Rodriguez. She's unconscious. Helen's heart sank. An unconscious person was much more difficult to rescue, especially if they needed to be carried through narrow spaces. Okay, Dr. Chen. I'm coming in to help you. It might take some time, so try to save your strength. Helen looked at the narrow opening and felt her chest tighten. She had always been claustrophobic since San Francisco, afraid of tight spaces that might collapse. but there was no choice. She turned to Mayor Williams. "I need some tools. A crowbar if you can find one. Rope. Anything we can use to move debris safely. And make sure everyone stays back. If there's an aftershock, this whole area could be dangerous." Max whined softly and touched her hand with his nose. Helen knelt beside him and scratched behind his ears. "I know, boy. I'm scared too, but we have to do this." She took a deep breath and began crawling into the gap. The space inside was darker than Helen had expected. Her flashlight created a small circle of light in what felt like an endless tunnel of concrete and twisted metal. The air was thick with dust, and every breath made her cough. She could hear Dr. Chen's voice ahead of her, calling out directions. "I'm about 20 feet in, near what used to be the reception desk." Helen crawled forward carefully, testing each movement to make sure she wasn't destabilizing the debris above her. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. Someone's life depended on her actions. "I can see your light," Dr. Chen called out. Helen's flashlight illuminated a small pocket of space where Dr. Chen sat against an overturned desk. Her right leg was pinned beneath a concrete block, but she appeared alert and responsive. "How's the pain?" Helen asked, moving closer. "Manageable. I think it's more trapped than injured. But, Mrs. Rodriguez..." Dr. Chen gestured to a still form lying nearby. Helen crawled over to examine the unconscious woman. She was breathing, which was a good sign. But there was a cut on her forehead and she didn't respond to Helen's voice. "We'll get both of you out," Helen promised, though she wasn't sure how. Mrs. Rodriguez would need to be carried, and the passage Helen had used was barely wide enough for one person crawling. Outside, she could hear Max barking, not his search bark, but an alert bark. He had found someone else. "Dr. Chen, I need to check on other survivors, but I'll be back. Try not to move too much, and call out if anything changes." The crawl back to daylight felt longer than the journey in. When Helen emerged, covered in dust and debris, Max was at a different section of the collapse, barking insistently. "There are more people," Helen told Mayor Williams, brushing dust from her hair. "Dr. Chen is trapped but conscious. Mrs. Rodriguez needs medical attention, and Max has found someone else." She followed Max to a pile of rubble near what had been the side of the building. The dog was focused on a spot where several concrete slabs had fallen in a way that created a small triangle of empty space. "Hello," Helen called out. "Help us," came a man's voice. "We're here." "How many of you?" "3. Tom Bradley from the insurance office, and 2 people from the library, Miss Watson and a young man who was studying. Helen assessed the situation quickly. This group was in a different section of the collapse, which meant she would need to create a new access route. But their location looked more stable than where Dr. Chen was trapped. Behind her, she could hear the sirens getting closer. Help was coming, but not fast enough. "Max, stay here and keep listening for them," she instructed the dog. "I'll be right back." She returned to Dr. Chen's location and began the difficult process of widening the opening. Using a crowbar someone had found, she carefully moved smaller pieces of debris, always checking to make sure she wasn't weakening the larger supports. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Every piece of concrete she moved brought back memories of San Francisco, of Jake's voice growing weaker beneath the rubble. But she pushed the memories aside and focused on the task at hand. After an hour of careful work, the opening was wide enough to bring Mrs. Rodriguez out on a stretcher, if they had a stretcher. Helen realized they would have to improvise. Using boards from a nearby fence and rope from someone's garage, Helen and several volunteers constructed a makeshift stretcher. The hardest part would be maneuvering it through the expanded opening without jarring Mrs. Rodriguez's injuries. Helen crawled back into the space, this time with 2 volunteers following her. Working together in the cramped conditions, They carefully lifted Mrs. Rodriguez onto the improvised stretcher and began the slow process of moving her toward daylight. Easy, Helen coached as they navigated a particularly narrow section. Support her head. Watch that beam above us. It took nearly 30 minutes to bring Mrs. Rodriguez out safely. When they finally emerged into sunlight, paramedics were waiting. The first professional rescue team had arrived. "Ma'am, are you in charge here?" asked the lead paramedic, a young woman with short red hair. "Not exactly," Helen replied. "I have search and rescue training, but I'm not officially—" "We can use all the help we can get," the paramedic interrupted. "Can you brief us on what you found?" Helen quickly explained the situation. Dr. Chen still trapped with a pinned leg, 3 more people in the side section that Max had located, and possibly others they hadn't found yet. "Our equipment is still being unloaded," the paramedic said. "It'll be at least another hour before we have everything we need for a full rescue operation." Helen looked at the building, then at Max, who was still stationed near the second group of survivors. An hour might be too long. "I can get Dr. Chen out now," she said, "and my dog can help locate anyone else who might be trapped." Working alongside the professional rescue team felt both familiar and strange to Helen. These were her people. She understood their language, their procedures, their urgency. But she was also acutely aware that she was no longer one of them, at least not officially. The team leader, Captain Morrison, was a man about Helen's age, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too many disasters. He watched Helen work with obvious respect. "You're good at this," he commented as they prepared equipment to free Dr. Chen. "How long since you worked search and rescue?" 3 years, Helen replied, not volunteering the reason for her retirement. "Mind if I ask why you left?" Helen paused in her work. Lost someone. Couldn't handle it anymore. Captain Morrison nodded, understanding. "We've all been there. The question is whether you can handle it now." It was a good question. Helen had been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't stopped to examine her own feelings. The panic she had felt at the beginning was gone, replaced by the familiar calm focus of emergency work. But she could feel Jake's memory hovering at the edge of her consciousness, waiting to overwhelm her if she let it. "I'm handling it so far," she said simply. Together, they developed a plan to free Dr. Chen safely. Using hydraulic equipment, they would lift the concrete block trapping her leg while Helen worked in the confined space to ensure she wasn't injured during the process. Helen crawled back through the passage for what she hoped would be the last time. Dr. Chen looked tired but alert, and she managed a weak smile when Helen's flashlight illuminated her face. "I was starting to wonder if you'd forgotten about me," she joked. "Never," Helen replied. "We're going to get you out of here. I need you to stay very still while we lift this concrete. Can you tell me if you feel any pain or numbness in your trapped leg?" "Some numbness, but I can still move my toes. I think it's just pinned, not crushed." Helen positioned herself carefully and called out to the team above. "Ready when you are?" The hydraulic equipment whined as it slowly lifted the concrete block. Helen watched Dr. Chen's face for signs of increased pain. "How does that feel?" "Better. The pressure is gone." Helen carefully examined Dr. Chen's leg. It was bruised and swollen, but nothing appeared broken. "Can you move it?" Dr. Chen flexed her ankle and winced. "It hurts, but I think I can walk with help. Let's get you out of here." Supporting Dr. Chen's weight, Helen helped her crawl toward the opening. It was slow going. Dr. Chen's injured leg made movement difficult, and the confined space meant they had to move carefully. When they finally emerged into daylight, Helen felt a wave of relief and exhaustion. That was 2 people safe. But Max was still barking at the other location, and there might be more survivors they hadn't found yet. The second rescue site presented a more complex problem. The three people trapped there were in a space that was partially accessible but highly unstable. Any attempt to widen the opening could cause a secondary collapse. Captain Morrison studied the situation with growing concern. "This is tricky," he admitted. "We might need to wait for the heavy equipment to arrive." Helen examined the debris pile with Max, who continued to indicate the presence of survivors in the unstable area. She could hear voices. They sounded strong, but increasingly anxious. "How long for the heavy equipment?" she asked. 3 hours, maybe 4? Helen looked at the angle of the fallen concrete slabs. She had seen similar formations before. There was usually a way in, but it required someone small and experienced to find it. "I think I can reach them from underneath," she said slowly. "Too dangerous." Captain Morrison shook his head. "If that pile shifts, you'll be buried." Helen studied the debris more carefully. There was a narrow space between the concrete slabs and the building's foundation, not much wider than a ventilation duct, but it led in the direction of the survivors. "Max can go first," she said. "He's smaller, and if the space is too unstable, he'll sense it." She looked down at her old partner. Max was 13 now, not as quick as he used to be, but his instincts were still sharp. He seemed to understand what she was asking and moved toward the narrow opening without hesitation. "Max, search!" Helen commanded. The dog disappeared into the gap between the concrete and the foundation. Helen waited, counting seconds that felt like hours. Finally, she heard his distant bark, the signal for survivors located and accessible. "He made it through," she told Captain Morrison. "If Max can get through, I can too." The space under the concrete slabs was even tighter than Helen had expected. She had to remove her jacket and push her flashlight ahead of her as she crawled forward. The concrete pressed down just inches above her back, and she could feel the weight of the entire collapsed section above her. This was exactly the situation that had triggered her claustrophobia since San Francisco, trapped in a narrow space with tons of debris overhead that could shift and fall at any moment. Her breathing became shallow, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. But she could hear Max ahead of her, and beyond that, human voices calling for help. She forced herself to keep moving forward. The space opened up slightly after about 20 feet, and Helen found herself in a small pocket where Max was waiting. Ahead, she could see light from cell phone flashlights and hear the three survivors talking. "Hello," she called out. "I'm here to help." "Thank God," came Tom Bradley's voice. "We were starting to think no one knew we were here." Helen crawled forward until she could see the three people. Tom Bradley was a man in his 50s, sitting with his back against a concrete block. Beside him sat an elderly woman, Miss Watson from the library, and a young man who couldn't have been more than 20. "Is anyone injured?" Helen asked. "Miss Watson has some cuts on her arms," Tom replied. "And David here, the young man, he's been feeling dizzy since the collapse." Helen examined each person quickly with her flashlight. Miss Watson's cuts appeared minor, but David's pupils were unequal in size, a possible sign of concussion. "David, can you tell me your last name and today's date?" she asked. The young man answered both questions correctly, but seemed confused about where he was. Helen made a mental note that he would need immediate medical attention once they got out. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," she told them. "I came in through a narrow passage, but it's too small for most people. We need to widen your exit route from this end." Helen studied the debris configuration around the three survivors. They were in a relatively stable pocket, but the entrance they would need to use was partially blocked by smaller concrete chunks and twisted metal. "Tom, I need you to help me move some of these smaller pieces," she said, "but we have to be very careful. If we disturb the wrong piece, the whole area could shift. Working by the light of their cell phones and Helen's flashlight, they began the painstaking process of clearing a path. Each piece of debris had to be evaluated. Was it supporting something larger, or could it be safely moved? Max positioned himself near the passage Helen had used, ready to alert them if the structure began to shift. After an hour of careful work, they had cleared a path wide enough for a person to crawl through, but Helen was worried about David. His concussion symptoms seemed to be getting worse, and she wasn't sure he could manage the difficult crawl to safety. "Miss Watson, can you go first?" Helen asked. "Tom will help you, and I'll stay with David." The elderly librarian nodded bravely. Despite being in her 70s, she was remarkably calm and determined. "I've been through worse than this," she said with a slight smile. Tom helped Miss Watson begin the crawl toward Helen's entrance route. It would take them at least 30 minutes to navigate the narrow spaces, but Helen felt confident they would make it safely. That left her alone with David, whose condition was becoming more concerning. David's confusion was getting worse. He kept asking where he was and why it was dark, even though Helen had explained the situation several times. She recognized the signs of a serious concussion. He needed medical attention soon. "David, I need you to listen to me carefully," she said, taking his hand. "We're going to crawl out of here, but it's going to be difficult. I need you to follow me exactly and do what I say, okay?" The young man nodded, but his eyes were unfocused. Helen wasn't sure he truly understood. She heard Max bark from the passage, his all-clear signal that Miss Watson and Tom had made it through safely. That was good news, but it also meant she was now alone with David in an increasingly unstable situation. Helen made a difficult decision. David's condition was too serious to risk the slow crawl through the narrow passage. She needed to find another way out, even if it was more dangerous. She examined the debris pile from inside their pocket. There was another possible route: up and over a fallen concrete slab rather than under it. It would require climbing and would expose them to more risk if the debris shifted, but it would be faster and might be easier for David in his confused state. "Change of plans," she told David. "We're going to climb instead of crawl." "Can you follow me up?" David looked up at the route Helen indicated. I think so. Why are we climbing?" Helen explained again, patiently, and began testing the stability of their new route. The concrete slab seemed solid enough to support their weight, and there were handholds where the rebar was exposed. Helen went first, testing each handhold and foothold before putting her full weight on it. The concrete was rough against her palms, and her muscles ached from hours of crawling and lifting debris. Behind her, David followed slowly. His confusion made him cautious, which was actually helpful. He took his time with each movement and didn't rush. Halfway up the slab, Helen heard an ominous creaking sound. She froze, listening intently. Somewhere in the debris pile, something was shifting. "David, stop moving," she whispered urgently. They waited in silence for several long seconds. The creaking stopped, but Helen could feel the concrete beneath her hands vibrating slightly. The whole structure was less stable than she had hoped. "We need to move faster," she told David. "Can you keep up if I go a little quicker?" David nodded, though Helen wasn't sure he fully understood the danger. She continued climbing, moving as quickly as she dared. The top of the slab was only 10 feet away now. From there, they could work their way to ground level. Another creaking sound, louder this time. Helen looked back and saw that David had stopped moving again. "I'm scared," he said simply. Helen's heart went out to him. He was probably no older than her nephew, and he was injured and confused, but they were so close to safety. "I know you're scared," she said gently, "but I'm right here with you, and we're almost out. Just follow my voice and keep climbing." When Helen finally reached the top of the concrete slab, she could see the rescue operation in full swing below. Professional teams were everywhere now, with proper equipment and systematic search procedures. Captain Morrison spotted her immediately. "Helen, are you okay?" "I have an injured person with me," she called back. "Possible concussion. We need medical help as soon as we're down." She turned back to help David with the final part of the climb. He was moving very slowly now, and she could see that the physical exertion was making his confusion worse. "Just a little further," she encouraged him. "You're doing great." When David finally reached the top of the slab, Helen could see that he was near exhaustion. The climb down to ground level would be easier, but she wasn't sure he had the strength left. "David, I'm going to help you down," she said. "We'll go very slowly." She positioned herself below him and guided his feet to secure footing. Step by step, they worked their way down to safety. When they finally reached ground level, paramedics were waiting. David was immediately placed on a stretcher and rushed to an ambulance. Helen sat down heavily on a nearby curb, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Every muscle in her body ached, and her hands were scraped and bleeding from the rough concrete. Max appeared beside her, his tail wagging weakly. The old dog was tired too, but his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. Captain Morrison approached Helen with a clipboard and a tired smile. "That's 5 people you helped rescue today," he said. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Dr. Chen, Miss Watson, Tom Bradley, and David. Not bad for someone who's been out of the business for 3 years." Helen scratched Max behind the ears. Max found them. "I just followed his lead." "Don't sell yourself short. Your team skills saved lives today." He paused, studying her face. "How are you feeling?" Really? It was a loaded question, and Helen knew it. How did she feel? 3 hours ago, she had been paralyzed by fear at the sound of concrete falling. Now she had spent the better part of the day crawling through collapsed buildings and pulling people from debris. "Tired," she said honestly. "Scared, but also—" She searched for the right word. "Useful." "I felt useful again." Captain Morrison nodded. "That's the addiction, isn't it? The knowledge that you can make a difference when everything goes wrong." Helen looked at the collapsed building, now swarming with professional rescue teams. They would spend hours more searching through every piece of debris, making sure no one else was trapped inside. "Are there more people?" she asked. "We don't think so. Your dog did a complete search of the perimeter and didn't find anyone else. The official count matches what we rescued." Helen felt a wave of relief. Everyone was safe. The nightmare scenario she had been living with for 3 years, another Jake trapped beneath the rubble while she was too slow or too weak to help, hadn't happened. "Captain Morrison," she said slowly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever lose anyone?" His face grew serious. "Yes, more than I'd like to remember." "How do you keep doing this work, knowing that—" Captain Morrison sat down on the curb beside Helen, removing his helmet and running a hand through his graying hair. "Can I tell you about my first major loss?" he asked. Helen nodded. 10 years ago, apartment fire. Family of 4 on the 3rd floor. We got the parents and 1 child out safely, but there was a 4-year-old boy still inside. I went back for him." He paused, staring at his hands. "Building was too unstable. Floor gave way before I could reach him." Helen felt her chest tighten. She knew how this story would end. "I blamed myself for months," Captain Morrison continued. "Thought if I'd been faster, stronger, smarter, I could have saved him. Nearly quit the job entirely." "What changed your mind?" "My partner at the time, a woman named Sarah, she said something that stuck with me. She said, 'You can't save everyone, but you can save someone. And if you quit, you won't save anyone at all. Helen considered this. It sounds simple when you put it like that. It is simple. That doesn't make it easy. He looked at her directly. What happened to you 3 years ago? Helen had never told the complete story to anyone except her trauma counselor. But sitting there in the aftermath of the rescue, with Max warm against her leg and the knowledge that 5 people were alive because of her actions, she found herself ready to talk. My partner Jake and I were in San Francisco for a training exercise. Earthquake hit during the drill. We were in a building that partially collapsed, similar to this one actually. She took a deep breath. Jake was trapped under a concrete beam. I tried to lift it, tried to move it, tried everything, but I wasn't strong enough, and by the time help arrived, she didn't finish the sentence. He died. He died, and I blamed myself completely. Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment. How do you feel about it now? Helen looked at the collapsed building, thinking about the question. How did she feel about Jake's death now, after today? I think, she said slowly, I think I've been carrying around the wrong lesson all these years. What do you mean? I focused on the fact that I couldn't save Jake. But I never thought about all the people I did save during my 8 years in search and rescue. I let one failure erase all the successes. Max shifted beside her, and Helen realized something else. And I never considered that Jake knew the risks. We all do, in this line of work. He wouldn't have wanted his death to end my career. Captain Morrison smiled. Now you're thinking like a professional again. Helen stood up, brushing dust off her clothes. Her body ached, but her mind felt clearer than it had in 3 years. Captain Morrison, can I ask you another question? Sure. Are you hiring? He laughed. As a matter of fact, we are. We've been short-staffed for months, and after what I saw today, I'd be happy to have you on the team. But are you sure you're ready? Helen looked down at Max, who was watching her with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog had never really retired. He'd just been waiting for her to be ready to work again. I think I am, she said. But I'd want to take some time to think about it. And I'd need to know if Max could come out of retirement too. A trained search dog? We'd be lucky to have him, even at his age. Helen felt a lightness in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. The idea of returning to search and rescue work was still scary, but it was no longer paralyzing. 2 weeks later, Helen was back at her sewing machine, but her perspective had completely changed. The shop was still her sanctuary, but it was no longer her hiding place. She had proven to herself that she could face her fears when it mattered. The bell above her door chimed, and Dr. Chen walked in, using a cane but otherwise looking healthy. Helen! I wanted to thank you again, she said, settling into the chair beside Helen's work table. How are you feeling about everything? Different, Helen replied honestly, like I found a part of myself I thought was lost forever. Are you going back to search and rescue? Helen had been thinking about this question constantly. Captain Morrison had offered her a position, and she was seriously considering it. But there were practical matters to consider. Maybe, she said. I've been thinking about doing both, keeping the shop, but also working part-time with the rescue team. There's no reason I have to choose just one thing. Dr. Chen smiled. That sounds like a perfect compromise. After Dr. Chen left, Helen returned to her sewing, but her mind was elsewhere. She was designing a new life for herself, one that honored both her need for peace and her calling to help others. The next morning, Helen drove to the county rescue headquarters. Captain Morrison had invited her to observe a training exercise, and she wanted to see how she felt being around the work again. Max sat in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the window. As they approached the facility, his excitement was obvious. The old dog remembered this world, and he was eager to return to it. The training exercise involved a simulated building collapse, wooden structures designed to mimic the conditions rescue workers might face in a real emergency. Helen watched as teams worked systematically through the debris, calling out to imaginary survivors and coordinating their movements with practiced precision. "Want to try a run?" Captain Morrison asked, appearing beside her. Helen hesitated. This was different from the emergency situation 2 weeks ago. This was deliberate, planned, a choice rather than a reaction to crisis. "What do you think, Max?" she asked her dog. Max's tail wagged enthusiastically. That was answer enough. Helen and Max joined one of the training teams for a search exercise. As they worked through the mock debris field, Helen felt the familiar rhythm of the work settling into her bones. Max moved with renewed energy, his training coming back despite his age. "Contact!" Max signaled at a pile of wooden beams. Helen called out to the survivor hidden in the training structure. "Can you hear me? We're here to help." A volunteer rescue worker playing a trapped victim responded weakly. "I'm here. My leg is stuck." Working with her team, Helen coordinated the careful removal of debris to reach the volunteer. Every movement was deliberate, safe, methodical. This was what she had trained for 8 years to do, and she was still good at it. When the exercise was over, Helen realized she was smiling. "So what do you think?" Captain Morrison asked as they walked back to the main building. "I think I want to do this," Helen said. "But I also want to keep my shop." "Is there a way to do both?" Captain Morrison considered this. "We could use you as a part-time specialist. You'd be on call for major emergencies, and you could participate in training exercises a few times a month. It wouldn't be full-time pay, but it would let you keep your other business." Helen felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly what she had been hoping for. A way to return to meaningful work without giving up the peaceful life she had built in Millbrook. And Max? Max would be welcome anytime. We can always use an experienced search dog, and it might be good for our younger dogs to learn from a veteran. They spent the next hour working out the details. Helen would maintain her certification through regular training, be available for emergencies within a 2-hour drive, and help with training new rescue workers. In return, she would receive a modest salary and the satisfaction of knowing she was using her skills to help people again. On the drive home, Helen felt lighter than she had in years. Max seemed to sense her mood and rested his head contentedly on her shoulder. "We're going back to work, old friend," she told him. "Are you ready for that?" Max's gentle woof sounded like agreement. 3 months later, Helen was working on a wedding dress when her emergency pager buzzed. She had forgotten how the sound could make her heart race with both anxiety and anticipation. The message was brief. Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 15. Multiple casualties. Search and rescue needed for possible victims thrown from vehicles. Helen looked at Max, who was already standing by the door with his rescue harness in his mouth. Even at 13, the old dog knew the sound of that pager meant work. "Ready, partner?" Helen asked, grabbing her rescue gear from the closet where it had waited for 3 years. The drive to the accident scene took 40 minutes. When they arrived, Helen saw a devastating sight: a 5-car pileup involving 2 trucks and 3 passenger vehicles. Emergency responders were everywhere, but the scene was chaotic. Captain Morrison spotted her immediately. "Glad you're here. We have 2 people unaccounted for. One was thrown from the red pickup truck, the other from the blue sedan. Both vehicles went over the embankment." Helen surveyed the area. The embankment was steep and covered with thick brush. A person thrown from a vehicle could have landed anywhere in a 50-yard radius. "Max, search," she commanded. The old dog moved carefully down the embankment, his nose working methodically. Helen followed, using her flashlight to scan the thick vegetation. After 20 minutes, Max alerted near a cluster of bushes 30 yards from the road. Helen pushed through the branches and found an elderly man, unconscious but breathing. He had multiple injuries but was alive. "Found one," she called up to the road crew. While paramedics worked to extract the first victim, Helen and Max continued searching for the second person. The light was fading, making the search more difficult. Max's next alert came from an area even further down the embankment, near a small creek. Helen found a young woman, conscious, but trapped under a fallen tree branch. "Thank God," the woman whispered when she saw Helen's flashlight. "I've been calling for help for hours." "We're going to get you out," Helen assured her. "What's your name?" "Lisa." "Is my daughter okay?" "She was in the car with me." Helen's heart sank. They had only accounted for the driver of the blue sedan. There had been a passenger. "How old is your daughter?" Helen asked Lisa while signaling for more help. "She's 8. She was wearing a pink jacket." Helen felt the familiar weight of urgency settle on her shoulders. A child, possibly injured, somewhere in this rough terrain as darkness fell. "Max, search for child," she commanded, using the specific training command for locating children. Max's demeanor changed subtly. Searching for children required different skills. They often hid when frightened, made less noise, and could fit into smaller spaces than adults. While the rescue team worked to free Lisa from under the tree branch, Helen and Max expanded their search pattern. They had been working for 6 hours straight, and Helen could see that Max was tired. But the old dog never hesitated, never slowed down.
An hour later, as full darkness settled over the scene, Max alerted near a culvert that ran under the highway. Helen crawled toward the concrete tunnel, calling out softly. "Hello? Is anyone there? We're here to help." A small, frightened voice answered from inside the culvert. "I'm scared. I want my mommy." "Hi there," Helen said gently, crawling into the tunnel with her flashlight. "My name is Helen. What's your name?" "Emma." "Emma, that's a beautiful name. Your mommy is looking for you, and she's going to be so happy when she sees you. Are you hurt anywhere?" The little girl, wearing the pink jacket her mother had described, was sitting in the culvert with her knees drawn up to her chest. She had some scratches on her face and arms, but appeared otherwise uninjured. "I think I'm okay," Emma said, "but I can't find my way back to the road." "That's okay, Emma. I'm going to help you get back to your mommy. But first, I want you to meet my friend Max."
Max had positioned himself at the entrance to the culvert, and he gave a gentle woof when Helen called his name. "He's a rescue dog," Helen explained. "He's very good at finding people and helping them get safe." Bringing Emma out of the culvert was easier than Helen had expected. The little girl was brave and followed instructions well. When they emerged into the lights of the rescue scene, there was a cheer from the assembled emergency workers. Lisa was on a stretcher, being prepared for transport to the hospital when she saw her daughter. "Emma!" Oh, thank God, tears streamed down Lisa's face. "Mommy!" Emma ran to her mother's side. Helen watched the reunion with a familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. This was why she did this work, for moments like this, when families were reunited against all odds. "Nice work," Captain Morrison said, appearing beside her. "How does it feel to be back?" "Like I never left," Helen replied honestly. As the ambulances departed with the rescued victims, Helen and Max helped with the final stages of the scene cleanup. Both the elderly man and Lisa were expected to make full recoveries, and Emma was uninjured except for minor cuts and scrapes. On the drive home, Helen reflected on how different this rescue felt from the building collapse 3 months ago. There was no panic, no paralyzing flashbacks to Jake's death. She had simply done her job, and done it well. "We're back, aren't we, Max?" she said to her tired partner. Max's contented sigh was all the answer she needed. Over the next 6 months, Helen settled into a rhythm that felt perfect for her life. Most days, she worked in her shop, taking satisfaction in the quiet precision of sewing and the steady stream of customers who had become friends.
But when her pager buzzed, she and Max transformed into their other selves, professional rescuers with years of experience and the skills to save lives. They were called out for a missing hiker in the mountains, a child who had fallen into a storm drain, and an elderly man who had become disoriented in the woods behind his house. Each call was different, but the core satisfaction remained the same. Helen also began helping with training at the rescue center, teaching new volunteers about search techniques and working with dogs. She found that she enjoyed the teaching aspect almost as much as the actual rescue work. "You're a natural instructor," Captain Morrison told her after watching her work with a group of new volunteers. "Have you ever considered making that a bigger part of your role?" Helen was intrigued by the idea. Training others would multiply her impact. Every person she taught could go on to save lives of their own. "What did you have in mind?" she asked.
"We're developing a new program for civilian volunteers, people who want to help in emergencies but don't want to commit to full-time rescue work. You could design and lead that program." Helen thought about all the people in Millbrook who had wanted to help during the building collapse but hadn't known what to do. A civilian training program could prepare regular community members to assist in emergencies. "I like that idea," she said. "A lot." 6 months later, Helen stood in front of her first class of civilian emergency response volunteers. 20 people from Millbrook and surrounding towns had signed up for the 8-week course she had designed. "Emergency response isn't just about professional rescue workers," she told the group. "Some of the most important help comes from ordinary people who know what to do in a crisis."
The curriculum covered basic search techniques, safety protocols, first aid, and how to assist professional rescue teams. Helen drew on her years of experience to create practical scenarios that civilians might actually encounter. Max, now 14 but still alert, served as the class demonstration dog. The volunteers learned how to work with search dogs, how to signal for help, and how to stay safe in dangerous situations. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of Helen's first customers at the sewing shop, was among the students. "I never thought I'd be crawling through obstacle courses at my age," she laughed after a particularly challenging training exercise. "But if something like that building collapse happens again, I want to be able to help." That was exactly the attitude Helen hoped to foster. She wasn't trying to turn civilians into professional rescuers, but she could teach them to be effective helpers who wouldn't endanger themselves or others.
By the end of the 8-week course, Helen's volunteers could conduct basic searches, provide first aid, and coordinate with professional emergency responders. More importantly, they had lost their fear of emergency situations and gained confidence in their ability to help. Graduation day was held at the rescue center, with Captain Morrison presenting certificates to each volunteer. "This program represents something special," he told the group. "You're proving that emergency response is a community responsibility, not just a job for professionals." Helen felt proud as she watched her students receive their certificates. She was saving lives not just through her own actions, but by empowering others to save lives too. 2 years after the building collapse that had changed her life, Helen received an unexpected visitor at her shop. David, the young man she had rescued from the Morrison building, walked through her door with a bright smile.
"Miss Martinez! I was hoping you'd remember me." Helen looked up from her sewing machine and smiled. David looked completely different, healthy, confident, and wearing a paramedic's uniform. "Of course I remember you. How are you feeling? Any lasting effects from the concussion?" "All healed up," David replied. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I wanted to thank you for saving my life, and I wanted to tell you about what I've been doing since then." David explained that his experience in the building collapse had inspired him to become a paramedic. He had completed his training and was now working with the County Emergency Medical Service. "You showed me what it means to help people in their worst moments," he said. "I decided I wanted to do that too." Helen felt a deep satisfaction hearing this. Her actions had not only saved David's life, but had inspired him to dedicate his life to saving others.
"There's something else," David continued. "I heard about your civilian training program, and I'd like to volunteer as an instructor. I could teach the medical response components." Helen was delighted. Having a paramedic as part of her training team would make the program even more effective. "That would be wonderful," she said. "When can you start?" As David left the shop, Helen reflected on how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been hiding from her past, afraid to use her skills because of one tragic failure. Now she was actively working to save lives and teaching others to do the same. Max, now spending most of his time sleeping in a sunny spot by the shop window, raised his head as Helen approached. "What do you think, old friend? Did we make the right choice coming back to this work?" Max's gentle tail wag suggested he approved. Helen's civilian emergency response program had grown beyond anything she had originally imagined. What started as a single class in Millbrook had expanded to neighboring towns, and she was training instructors to run programs in other regions. On a warm Tuesday morning, she was working with her newest class when her pager buzzed with an urgent message. "School bus accident on Route 7. Multiple children involved. All available units respond." Helen's heart raced as she read the message. A school bus accident meant multiple young victims, exactly the kind of complex emergency that required every available resource. "Class dismissed," she announced. "This is a real emergency. Those of you who have completed the full training program, you're welcome to come observe, but stay well back from the scene unless specifically asked to help." 6 of her advanced students chose to come with her, including Mrs. Patterson and David, who was responding in his official capacity as a paramedic. The accident scene was overwhelming. The school bus had skidded off the road and tipped onto its side in a shallow ditch. Children were crying, parents were arriving in panic, and emergency vehicles filled the area. Helen quickly located Captain Morrison. "What do you need?" she asked. "The bus driver is trapped inside, and we think there might be one student still unaccounted for. The bus company is checking their records, but meanwhile we need to search the area in case someone was thrown from the bus or wandered away confused." Helen looked at Max, but the old dog was moving slowly today. At 14, he was nearing the end of his working life. "Max might not be up for a full search," she admitted, "but my civilian volunteers can help coordinate the search pattern." What happened next made Helen incredibly proud of her training program. Her civilian volunteers spread out around the accident scene, working in pairs to systematically search the area. They stayed in radio contact, followed safety protocols, and coordinated with professional rescue teams exactly as they had been trained. Mrs. Patterson, working with another volunteer, found a small backpack in the woods 50 yards from the road. "This might belong to the missing student," she radioed to Helen. "It has the name Tommy written inside." Helen relayed this information to Captain Morrison, who confirmed that Tommy Rodriguez was indeed the missing child. 8-year-old boy wearing a red shirt, came the description. Helen expanded the search pattern around where the backpack was found. If Tommy had been thrown from the bus, he could be anywhere in the surrounding area. David, working in his paramedic capacity, was treating children with minor injuries when he spotted something. "Movement in the trees about 100 yards east of the bus," he radioed. Helen and 2 of her volunteers moved toward the location David had indicated. They found Tommy sitting under a large oak tree, crying but apparently uninjured. "Hey there, Tommy," Helen said gently, approaching slowly. "I'm Helen, and these are my friends. We're here to help you." "I want my mom," Tommy said through his tears. "We're going to take you to your mom right now," Helen assured him. "Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere?" Tommy shook his head. "I'm just scared." The bus made a loud noise, and then everything was sideways. Helen examined Tommy quickly and found no obvious injuries. He appeared to have been thrown clear of the bus when it tipped over and had wandered into the woods, confused and frightened. "Let's go find your mom," Helen said, helping Tommy to his feet. The school bus accident response was considered a textbook example of multi-agency cooperation. No one had been seriously injured, the missing child had been found quickly, and the whole operation had been completed efficiently. A week later, Helen received a call from the State Emergency Management Office. "Ms. Martinez, we've been following your civilian training program with great interest," said Director Sarah Williams. "We'd like to discuss expanding it statewide." Helen was stunned. A statewide program would mean training thousands of volunteers and potentially saving many more lives. "What would that involve?" she asked. "We'd provide funding for you to develop standardized training materials and train a network of instructors across the state. You'd basically become the director of civilian emergency response training for the entire state." It was an incredible opportunity, but it would also mean giving up her quiet life in Millbrook and her peaceful sewing shop. "Can I have some time to think about it?" Helen asked. "Of course. But I hope you'll seriously consider it. Your program could save hundreds of lives." After hanging up the phone, Helen sat in her shop, surrounded by the fabrics and sewing machines that had given her comfort for 5 years. Max was sleeping in his favorite sunny spot, and through the window she could see the familiar street where she had built her new life. The decision wasn't as difficult as she had expected. Helen called Director Williams back the next morning. "I'm honored by the offer," she said, "but I'd like to propose a different arrangement." She outlined her counteroffer. She would develop the statewide training program and materials, but she would do it from Millbrook. She would travel regularly to train instructors and oversee the program, but she wanted to keep her shop and her roots in the community that had welcomed her. "The whole point of civilian emergency response is that it comes from the community level," she explained. "I think I can be more effective if I stay connected to that community rather than moving to a state office." Director Williams agreed to the arrangement. Helen would become the state's civilian emergency response coordinator while maintaining her base in Millbrook. The announcement made the local newspaper. Local seamstress named State Emergency Response Coordinator. Helen laughed at the headline. It perfectly captured the dual nature of her life. Over the next year, Helen's program trained over 2,000 civilian volunteers across the state. Each class was taught by instructors she had personally trained, using materials she had developed based on her years of experience. The program's success was measured not just in numbers, but in lives saved. Civilian volunteers assisted in dozens of emergency responses, from missing person searches to natural disaster relief. Helen kept track of every success story, every life saved by someone she had trained. It was her way of honoring Jake's memory, turning his death into something that would prevent other deaths. 5 years after returning to emergency response work, Helen sat in her shop working on a quilt. It was a special project. Each square represented one of the lives saved by her civilian volunteers. The quilt had grown to include over 200 squares. Max was no longer with them. The old dog had died peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier, at the age of 16. He had worked almost until the end, finally retiring only when his arthritis made it too difficult to climb through debris. Helen missed him terribly, but she had found a new partner. Luna was a young German shepherd with excellent search instincts and boundless energy. She was still in training, but she showed great promise. The shop bell chimed, and Captain Morrison walked in, now a good friend as well as colleague. "How's the retirement planning going?" he asked with a grin. Helen laughed. At 47, she wasn't planning to retire anytime soon, but they had been discussing what would happen to her programs when she eventually stepped back. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "I want to make sure the civilian training program continues long after I'm gone. It needs to be sustainable." They discussed establishing a permanent training center in Millbrook with multiple instructors and a steady funding stream. Helen's shop could remain part of the center, a reminder that emergency response came from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. "You know," Captain Morrison said, "when I first met you at that building collapse, I never imagined you'd create something this big." Helen thought back to that terrifying day when she had been paralyzed by fear and memories of Jake's death. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "I never imagined it either," she admitted. "I thought my useful life was over. I was wrong." "The best thing about this job," Captain Morrison observed, "is that it's never really over. Every person you train will train others. Every life you save will go on to touch other lives. The ripple effects never end." 10 years after the Morrison building collapse, Helen stood in front of a new building that had been constructed on the same site. It was modern, with state-of-the-art safety features and earthquake-resistant design. A plaque near the entrance read, "In memory of all those who serve in emergency response, and in honor of the civilian volunteers who make our communities safer." Helen had been invited to the building's dedication ceremony. As she stood there, she thought about all the changes in her life since that frightening day when the old building had fallen. Dr. Chen, now fully recovered and serving as the town's emergency response coordinator, introduced Helen to the crowd. 10 years ago, our community faced a disaster that could have been much worse," she said. "But we had heroes among us. Professionals like Helen Martinez, who risked their lives to save others, and ordinary citizens who rose to the occasion." Helen had been asked to speak, but she had decided to keep her remarks brief. "Emergency response isn't about being fearless," she told the gathered crowd. "It's about being afraid, but doing what needs to be done anyway. All of you have that capacity. The question is whether you'll choose to develop it." After the ceremony, Helen walked back to her shop. Luna trotted beside her, alert and ready. At 8 years old, Luna was now an experienced search dog in her own right. The shop looked exactly as it had years before, filled with colorful fabrics and the gentle hum of sewing machines. But now, it also served as the headquarters for the state civilian emergency response program, with training materials and communication equipment sharing space with thread and buttons. Helen had found her perfect balance, a quiet life punctuated by moments of intense purpose, a peaceful sanctuary that also served as a launching point for saving lives. Helen was working on a wedding dress when her emergency pager buzzed with a message that made her blood run cold. "Major earthquake, magnitude 7.2, epicenter 50 miles south. Multiple building collapses reported. All units respond immediately." It had been 15 years since Helen had faced a major earthquake. The small tremor that had brought down the Morrison building was nothing compared to this. She looked at Luna, who was already standing by the door with her rescue harness. At 8, Luna was in her prime as a search dog, experienced but still strong and agile. "Are you ready for the big one, girl?" Helen asked. Luna's confident bark suggested she was. The drive to the earthquake zone took 2 hours through increasingly damaged terrain. Helen could see the evidence of the quake's power: cracked roads, fallen power lines, and buildings that had pancaked or tilted at impossible angles. The command center had been set up in a parking lot outside the worst-hit area. Captain Morrison, now graying but still energetic, was coordinating the massive response effort. Helen! Thank God you're here, he called out when he saw her arriving. We have multiple buildings down and possibly hundreds of people trapped. This is the big one we've been training for. Helen felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination. This was exactly the kind of disaster she had run from after Jake's death. But now, instead of paralyzing her, the magnitude of the crisis focused her mind. Where do you need us? She asked. There's a shopping center that pancaked about half a mile from here. We think there were dozens of people inside when it collapsed. That's where I want you and Luna to start. The collapsed shopping center was a devastating sight. What had once been a 2-story building was now a pile of concrete and twisted metal barely 6 feet high. The scale of destruction was overwhelming, but Helen had learned to break down overwhelming situations into manageable pieces. Instead of seeing the entire collapsed building, she focused on one section at a time. Luna, search, she commanded. The dog moved systematically along the edge of the debris field, her nose working constantly. Within minutes, she alerted at 3 different locations. Multiple contacts, Helen radioed to the command post. We need search teams at the north end, center section, and east side. As professional rescue teams began the delicate work of reaching the trapped survivors, Helen and Luna continued their search pattern. They found evidence of 12 people trapped in various sections of the collapsed building. The rescue work was slow and dangerous. Every piece of debris that was moved could potentially cause another collapse. Helen found herself thinking of Jake, but not with the old panic and guilt. Instead, she felt his presence as a reminder to be careful, to think before acting, to protect her teammates as well as the victims. Working with Luna and 3 other search teams, Helen helped coordinate the rescue of 11 people from the shopping center debris. One person, an elderly man who had been in critical condition, died before they could reach him. Helen felt the familiar pang of loss, but it didn't overwhelm her the way Jake's death had. She had learned that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, not everyone could be saved. That didn't make the effort less valuable. The earthquake response lasted 3 days. Helen and Luna worked almost continuously, taking only brief breaks for food and rest. They searched through the remains of an apartment building, a collapsed highway overpass, and a damaged school. By the end of the 3rd day, they had helped locate and rescue 43 people. The overall death toll from the earthquake was remarkably low, thanks to better building codes and the coordinated response of professional and civilian emergency teams. Helen's civilian volunteers had been instrumental in the success. Trained volunteers from communities across the state had converged on the disaster area, providing support services, conducting searches, and assisting professional teams. As Helen finally drove home, exhausted but satisfied, she reflected on how far she had come since her breakdown 15 years earlier. The young woman who had been paralyzed by one failure had become a leader who could coordinate the response to a major disaster. Luna slept in the passenger seat, equally exhausted. The dog had performed flawlessly under the most challenging conditions, proving that Helen's instincts about her had been correct. When they finally reached Millbrook, Helen was surprised to find people lining the main street, holding signs and applauding. Word had spread about her role in the earthquake response, and the community wanted to show their appreciation. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but still active in the emergency response program, presented Helen with a key to the city. "You've made our whole community proud," she said, "and you've made us safer too." 6 months after the earthquake, Helen received an unexpected phone call from Washington, D.C. "Ms. Martinez, this is Director James Conway from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected to receive the National Emergency Response Medal for your work developing civilian response programs and your actions during the recent earthquake." Helen was speechless. The National Emergency Response Medal was the highest civilian honor for emergency services, rarely awarded to non-federal employees. "The ceremony will be in Washington next month," Director Conway continued. "The president will be presenting the awards personally." After hanging up the phone, Helen sat in her shop, trying to process what had just happened. From a terrified woman hiding from her past to a national medal recipient, the journey seemed impossible. Luna sensed her excitement and nuzzled her hand. Helen scratched behind the dog's ears and smiled. "Well, girl, looks like we're going to meet the president." The ceremony in Washington was both overwhelming and humbling. Helen stood with 11 other recipients, firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and emergency coordinators who had all made extraordinary contributions to saving lives. When the president pinned the medal to her jacket, he said quietly, "The civilian training program you developed has become a model for the entire nation. You've probably saved more lives than we'll ever know." Helen thought of Jake, wishing he could have been there to see this moment. But she realized that, in a way, he was there. His death had been the catalyst that eventually led to her creating something that would prevent other deaths. The morning after returning from Washington, Helen was back at her sewing machine, working on a christening gown for Mrs. Patterson's great-granddaughter. The National Emergency Response Medal sat on the shelf beside her thread collection, looking oddly out of place among the everyday tools of her trade. Luna was back in her favorite spot by the window, and the shop felt exactly as it always had: peaceful, productive, normal. Helen had learned that this was what she valued most: the ability to live a quiet life while also being ready to spring into action when needed. Her phone rang, and she was surprised to hear David's voice. The young man she had rescued from the Morrison building 15 years earlier was now the county's chief paramedic. "Helen, I have some news I wanted to share with you personally," he said. "I just accepted a position to head up a new state program, a rapid response team that will work with your civilian volunteers during major emergencies." Helen felt a surge of pride. David had not only become an excellent paramedic, but was now taking on leadership roles that would help save even more lives. "That's wonderful news," she said. "When do you start?" "Next month. And I was hoping you might help design the training protocols for how professional responders can work most effectively with civilian volunteers." It was exactly the kind of project Helen loved, taking her experience and using it to make the whole system more effective. "I'd be happy to help," she said. "When can we start?" As they discussed the details of the new program, Helen realized that her work was far from over. At 52, she had many more years of contributing to emergency response, both as an active rescuer and as a trainer and coordinator. 5 years later, Helen stood before another class of civilian volunteers, this one held in the auditorium of the new Millbrook Emergency Response Training Center. The center had been built with federal and state funding, and it attracted students from across the country. Luna, now showing her age at 13, lay at Helen's feet as she addressed the class. A younger dog, Rex, was already in training to eventually take Luna's place, though Helen hoped that wouldn't be necessary for several more years. "Emergency response is not about being a hero," Helen told her students, delivering the same message she had been teaching for years. "It's about being prepared, staying calm, and knowing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the situation calls for it." Among the students was a young woman named Sarah, who reminded Helen of herself at that age. Confident, dedicated, but carrying some hidden pain. After class, Sarah approached Helen with a question. "Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something personal? I've heard that you used to be afraid of rescue work after a traumatic experience. How did you overcome that?" Helen considered her answer carefully. This was always the hardest question to answer because the truth was complex. I didn't overcome it so much as I learned to work with it, she said finally. The fear is still there, but it doesn't control my actions anymore. And I learned that running away from something that scared me didn't make me safer. It just made me smaller. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I lost my partner in a climbing accident last year. We were both rescue volunteers. I've been afraid to go back to it, but I also can't stop thinking about all the people who need help. Helen felt a familiar recognition. This was exactly where she had been 15 years ago. Would you like to talk more about it? She offered. Maybe over coffee after the next class?
Helen Martinez continued working as a search and rescue coordinator and civilian training director until she was 65. By then, her programs had trained over 50,000 civilian volunteers across the country, and similar programs had been adopted in 12 other nations. She officially retired from active rescue work, but remained involved in training and program development. The Helen Martinez Center for Civilian Emergency Response became a permanent fixture in Millbrook, ensuring that her work would continue long after she was gone. Luna worked until she was 15, finally retiring to spend her last years as a beloved shop dog, an occasional demonstration animal for basic training classes. Rex proved to be an excellent successor, and Helen trained 3 more dogs over the years. The shop on Maple Street remained Helen's sanctuary throughout her career. Even during her busiest years coordinating statewide emergency response, she spent her quiet hours there, sewing and thinking and remembering why she had chosen this balanced life. The wedding dress she was working on the day of the Morrison building collapse was finally finished, 20 years later, when the bride's daughter got married. On Helen's 70th birthday, the town of Millbrook held a celebration in her honor. A statue was unveiled in the town square. Helen and Max, captured in bronze at the moment they emerged from the collapsed Morrison building with Dr. Chen. The inscription read, "In honor of Helen Martinez and all who choose courage over fear, service over safety, and hope over despair." Helen stood before the statue with mixed emotions. She was proud of what she had accomplished, but she was also aware that none of it would have happened without that terrible day when Jake died beneath the rubble in San Francisco. Sarah, now the director of the State Civilian Emergency Response Program, spoke at the ceremony. "Helen taught us that heroism isn't about being fearless," she said. "It's about being afraid and acting anyway. It's about turning our worst experiences into our greatest strengths. And it's about understanding that we all have the capacity to save lives. We just need the training and the courage to use it." As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Helen walked slowly back to her shop. At 70, she moved more carefully than she used to, but her mind was still sharp, and her commitment to emergency response remained strong. The shop looked exactly as it had 40 years earlier when she first opened it, except for the awards and commendations that now covered one wall. The National Emergency Response Medal held the place of honor, but Helen's favorite was a simple handwritten note from Emma, the little girl she had found in the culvert all those years ago. Emma was now a doctor, and she had written, "Thank you for teaching me that even in the scariest moments, someone will come to help." Helen sat down at her sewing machine and picked up her current project, a baby blanket for one of her former students who had just become a grandmother. As she worked, she thought about all the lives that had been saved by people she had trained, all the disasters that had been managed more effectively because of the programs she had developed. But most of all, she thought about Jake. His death had nearly destroyed her, but it had also ultimately led to her life's greatest work. She had learned that tragedy could be transformed into purpose, that failure could become the foundation for success, and that running away from fear only gave it more power over your life. The shop bell chimed, and a young man walked in, carrying a small dog in his arms. "Are you Helen Martinez?" he asked nervously. "I am," Helen replied, setting down her sewing. "My name is Tom Bradley Jr.," he said. "My father was one of the people you rescued from the Morrison building 20 years ago. He always said he owed his life to you." Helen remembered Tom Bradley, the insurance office worker who had been trapped with Miss Watson and David in the side section of the collapse. "How is your father?" she asked.
"He passed away last year," Tom Jr. said. "But before he died, he made me promise to do something. He wanted me to join your civilian emergency response program. He said every person you train goes on to save other lives, and he wanted to be part of that chain." Helen smiled and gestured to a chair. "When can you start?" As Tom Jr. settled in to discuss the training program, Helen felt the familiar satisfaction of seeing her work continue to ripple outward. Every person she trained would train others. Every life saved would go on to touch other lives. The circle would continue to grow long after she was gone. Outside, the afternoon sun painted Maple Street in golden light, just as it had on that first day when Helen had arrived in Millbrook, broken and afraid. She had been running from her past then, but she had learned that the past could become a teacher rather than a prison. Her story was far from over, but she knew now how it would end, not with fear and regret, but with the knowledge that she had taken her worst experience and transformed it into something that would save lives for generations to come. The young woman who had once been paralyzed by the sound of falling concrete had become a force for hope in a world where disasters were inevitable, but despair was optional. And in her quiet shop on Maple Street, surrounded by the tools of her peaceful trade and the symbols of her heroic calling, Helen Martinez continued to prove every day that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose courage over fear. The sewing machine hummed gently as Helen worked, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible, came the sound of her emergency pager, ready to call her to action one more time should the need arise. But for now, there was only the peaceful rhythm of needle and thread, the warm sunlight through the window, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived in service to others. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.